There is a line Jung wrote near the end of his life, not in a lecture, not for an audience. It surfaced in the private material, in the margins of a man who had descended into his own darkness and returned, changed, permanently, carrying something most people would have called a wound. He wrote, "The doctor is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals. Sit with that, not the skilled physician, not the educated one, not the one who has read everything and mastered the theory, the wounded one." This is the paradox that medicine refuses to teach, that theology dresses up and hides, that self-help, with its relentless optimism and its glossy vocabulary, has never been brave enough to speak directly. The wound is not the obstacle, the wound is the door, and somewhere, in the place where your suffering lives, the place you have tried to close off, paper over, outrun, medicate, spiritualize away, somewhere in that exact location, Jung believed something ancient and enormous was waiting, not to destroy you, not to humiliate you, but to initiate you. You have carried a particular kind of pain, perhaps for years, perhaps for decades, perhaps so long that you can no longer imagine yourself without it, without the loss, the betrayal, the collapse, the thing that broke you open in the middle of what should have been your life. You have probably asked, in the silence of 3 in the morning, or in the hollow aftermath of a grief no one else seemed to understand, why me? That is the right question. But Jung believed the answer was not what you expected, not punishment, not accident, not random cruelty distributed carelessly across a meaningless universe. He believed it was selection, not the selection of a tyrant god choosing favorites for suffering, but something far stranger, the selection of the psyche itself, the deep, intelligent, purposeful unconscious, choosing a particular soul for a particular journey. And the name Jung gave to that soul and to the force awakening inside their wound is one of the most profound archetypes in the entire history of depth psychology. The wounded healer. If this is the first time you have heard these words, and they reach something inside you, something that recognizes itself without being told why, then stay with this video. And if you find that this material transforms something in you, that it gives language to what you have only known as pain, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. What is built here is built slowly, carefully, for people who are ready for depth, for people who are done with surface answers. This is Shadow and Virtue, and this is your story. You are not here by accident. People who find their way to Jung, who find their way specifically to the concept of the wounded healer, are not people who stumbled into psychology out of idle curiosity. They are not browsings, they are searching. And what they are searching for is not information. What they are searching for is recognition. So let this be said plainly. You have suffered in ways you could not always explain to others. Not because the suffering was invisible, though sometimes it was, but because its dimensions were too large, too interior, too layered for the ordinary conversations that surround a life. You tried, perhaps. You reached out, and you received sympathy or advice or well-meaning platitudes. And you returned home carrying the same weight, heavier now by the quiet loneliness of not being fully seen. You have known grief that did not follow the schedule grief is supposed to follow. You have known betrayal so precise in its targeting of your deepest trust that it felt almost surgical. You have known the particular devastation of watching a version of your life, a marriage, a purpose, a self, dissolve not in one dramatic moment but slowly, like something left in rain. And somewhere in the aftermath of all of this, something shifted, not healed, not resolved, not what anyone would call recovery, but shifted. Something cracked open, and what entered through the crack was not more darkness, though the darkness remained, but something older, something that felt less like your personal pain and more like a current, like a voice that had been trying to reach you for years and had finally, through the only opening available to it, broken through. Jung would recognize this moment immediately. He would not call it a breakdown, though breakdown may have been part of it. He would call it the beginning of the Nigredo, the first stage of the alchemical process he used to map the transformative journey of the psyche, the blackening, the dissolution, the necessary destruction of who you were so that who you are meant to become can take its first breath. He would also ask you something that almost no one around you thought to ask, not what happened to you, but what is the wound trying to teach you, and who does it want you to become? Because in the framework Jung built, through decades of his own suffering, his own descent, his own long walk through what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, the wound was never arbitrary. The wound was always purposeful, and its purpose was always, eventually, the same, to strip away everything false so that what was true could finally stand. You are not too sensitive. You are not too broken. You are not behind. You are not the sum of what was done to you. You are something that is only now beginning to emerge. And the emergence began exactly at the point that felt most like an ending. Before there was psychology, there was myth, and Jung understood, in a way that separated him from every other figure in the history of the mind, that myth was not the opposite of truth. Myth was the container that truth poured itself into when it could not yet be spoken directly. This is why, when Jung reached for the deepest possible image, for the healer who heals through their wound rather than despite it, he did not reach for a clinical study. He reached for a story, the story of Chiron. Chiron was a centaur, half man, half horse, a creature who lived between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Among the centaurs, who were known for brutality and chaos, Chiron was something anomalous, civilized, learned, gentle. He was a teacher of extraordinary skill. The myths tell us that Heracles trained under him, and Achilles, and Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine itself. Chiron understood the body, the stars, the plants that healed, the wounds that killed. He was, in every sense of the word, a master. And then, through an accident that was not his fault, an arrow tipped with the blood of the Hydra, loosed carelessly by Heracles in the midst of a battle, Chiron was struck. In the knee, in the place where the animal part of him joined the human. The wound would not heal, not because Chiron lacked skill. He possessed more knowledge of healing than anyone alive, but because the poison was too deep, too old, too woven into the nature of the wound itself. He could not cure it. He could not close it. He carried it, open and raw, for the rest of his immortal life. And here is what the myth contains that is so shattering. Chiron continued to teach. He continued to heal others. He became, if anything, more profoundly capable as a healer because of the wound. Because the wound had opened in him a dimension of understanding that his mastery alone could never have reached. A kind of knowledge that does not come from books or skill or intelligence. A knowledge that only comes from suffering. The capacity to be, as Kerényi, Jung's colleague and mythologist, described it, at home in the darkness of suffering, not managing the darkness, not surviving it, not recovering from it, being at home in it. This is the first principle of the wounded healer archetype, and it cannot be arrived at by any route other than the wound itself. When Jung encountered this myth, and he encountered it not merely as a scholar, but as a man who was himself carrying wounds that would not close, he recognized something. He saw in Chiron not a cautionary tale, but a blueprint, a psychological truth embedded in the oldest layer of human storytelling. Jung had suffered profoundly. His childhood was strange and isolated. His father was a pastor whose faith was quietly dying, And Jung watched the death of a man's inner life from close proximity. The knowledge of that particular despair, faith collapsing from the inside, leaving only the outer form, entered him early and never left. His break with Freud, the man who had been in some sense a father to him, was not merely professional, it was existential. It plunged Jung into a period of psychological crisis so severe that he later described it as a confrontation with the unconscious, unlike anything he had encountered before. For years he walked along the edge. He wrote and drew and painted and built stone towers, quite literally, with his hands, as attempts to stay connected to reality while the forces of the deep psyche broke over him like waves. He emerged from this period, not healed exactly, but transformed, and what he brought back from that descent was the material that would form the architecture of analytical psychology, the theory of individuation, the concept of the shadow, the map of the collective unconscious, the articulation of the archetypes. Everything he gave the world came through the wound, not in spite of it. Through it, the ego, the part of us we call I, the conscious self that navigates daily life, manages the persona, makes decisions, holds an identity, is only the visible surface of the psyche. Beneath it, stretching into depths that have no bottom, is the unconscious, personal first, made of everything the individual has experienced, repressed, forgotten, feared. And beneath that, deeper still, the collective unconscious, the vast inherited reservoir of all human experience, expressed through the universal patterns Jung called archetypes. The healthy psyche, in Jung's understanding, is not the one that has escaped conflict. It is the one that has achieved a living, dynamic relationship between the conscious ego and the unconscious depths. This is individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who one truly is, as opposed to who one was shaped to perform. And individuation does not begin in comfort. It does not begin in success. It does not begin in the years when everything is working and the persona is intact and the life one is living matches the life one was told to want. Individuation begins in crisis. It begins at the exact moment the old structure fails. When the marriage dissolves, when the career that defined you collapses, when the faith that held the world together goes silent, when the loss arrives that nothing prepared you for, when the person you were before the wound ceases to be viable. Jung called this moment, borrowing from alchemy, the Nigredo, the blackening. In the alchemical tradition that fascinated Jung, precisely because it mirrored the deepest processes of the psyche, the Nigredo was the first and most terrifying stage of the opus, the great work of transformation. The original material had to be broken down completely, reduced to blackness, before anything new could emerge. It felt like death. Often, the person undergoing it was convinced it was death, not metaphorical death, something that felt absolute, like the extinction of something essential. But it was not death. It was the beginning of the opus. When Jung spoke of the wounded healer, when he looked at a life shaped by suffering that resisted resolution, he did not romanticize it. He was not suggesting that pain was pleasant, or that one should seek it, or that suffering was inherently ennobling. What he was suggesting was something more precise and far more disturbing in its implications, that certain wounds are selected, not by a punishing God, not by bad luck, not by the careless cruelty of circumstance, but by the psyche itself, by the deep, purposeful intelligence of the unconscious, which has a trajectory of its own and will engineer the conditions necessary for that trajectory to unfold. This is what Jung called Enantiodromia, the tendency of things to become their opposite when they reach an extreme. The principle, drawn from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, to whom Jung returned repeatedly, that extreme one-sidedness in any direction generates the irresistible force of its own reversal. The person who has lived entirely in the persona, performing, achieving, maintaining the mask at all costs, will eventually be broken open by everything the persona excluded. The person who has suppressed the shadow, the darkness, the rage, the grief, the authentic self beneath the acceptable self, will find that the shadow becomes too large to contain. The Enantiodromia arrives, and when it does not knock politely, it tears. The wound, then, is often the Enantiodromia made flesh. The moment when psyche can no longer sustain the direction that the ego was demanding of it, and for those in whom the wounded healer archetype is active. Those souls who are not merely broken, but are broken towards something. The wound also carries what Jung described as a numinous quality, something sacred, something that does not belong entirely to the personal history of the individual but connects, through the wound, to the deeper layer of the collective unconscious where the archetypes lives. The wound, in these cases, is a threshold, not just to one's own depth, but to the depth of the human condition. There is a danger here that Jung was careful to name. When a wounded person begins to awaken to the archetypal dimension of their suffering, when they begin to recognize that their pain may carry a larger purpose, there is a temptation that must be navigated with great care, the temptation of inflation. Inflation, in Jungian terms, is the expansion of the ego through identification with an archetype. The wounded person who begins to believe that their suffering makes them special, more evolved, more chosen, more spiritually advanced than those who have not suffered in the same way, has fallen into the shadow of the wounded healer archetype. The wounded healer is not a badge of honor. It is not an identity to be adopted or displayed. It is a living process, messy, ongoing, humbling, non-linear. The person through whom this archetype operates does not transcend their wound. They carry it consciously, alongside their capacity to accompany others through their own darkness. The capacity to hold both, to be strong and broken at the same time, is the mark of genuine individuation in the wounded healer. Jung understood that the unconscious speaks most directly through the medium of dreams, not in the literal language of waking life, but in the ancient symbolic language of image, the language that predates words and carries meanings that words cannot hold. Those who are living through the wounded healer initiation frequently report a particular quality of dreaming that distinguishes this period from anything that came before. The dreams become larger, not larger in the sense of more dramatic, though they are often that, larger in the sense of feeling more real than waking life. Certain dream images appear with particular frequency in those undergoing the wounded healer initiation. The first is the descent, the dream of going down into a cellar, a cave, underground chambers, the earth itself. These dreams mark the Nigredo. The psyche is mapping, in its own language, the process that is occurring. The descent is not punishment, it is direction. The dreamer is being shown where they need to go, even as everything in the waking ego resists going there. Then comes the wound that will not close. This dream appears in many forms, a wound on the body that does not bleed, but will not seal. Sometimes, the dreamer watches themselves try to close it and finds that it resists. Sometimes the wound contains something inside it, a light, a strange growth, something alive. This is the psyche's direct representation of the Chiron wound. The message is not that something is wrong with the dreamer. The message is that this particular opening must remain open, that its closure would be the end of something essential. The animal that is also human appears next, a being between worlds, neither fully one thing nor fully another. The horse, the wolf, the bear. Animals that in Jungian dream interpretation carry the energy of the instinctual self, the pre-civilized layer of being that has been most suppressed. When this figure appears, it is rarely threatening. More often, it is simply present, watching, waiting, as if it has been waiting for a very long time and has learned patience. This is the part of the self that the wound has begun to unlock. The instinctual knowing, the body wisdom, the something that remembers what the conscious mind has been trained to forget. And then the teacher in the dark, a figure wise and ambiguous, encountered underground who does not always speak in words. Sometimes it simply stands. Sometimes it hands the dreamer something, a key, a stone, a small flame. In Jungian terms, this is an aspect of the self, the greater totality of the psyche, of which the ego is only a fragment, beginning to make itself visible. This is the unconscious signaling that the initiation is underway. Finally, the crossing. A bridge, a river, a gate, and on the other side, something that cannot quite be seen. The dreamer does not always cross. Sometimes they stand at the edge for what feels like hours. This dream marks the point of transition in the individuation process. The moment between the old self and the new, when the ego is no longer what it was, and the new form has not yet solidified. Jung had enormous compassion for this state. He understood that the between, the liminal, the threshold, was not a problem to be solved but a process to be honored, and those who emerge from it are not the same as those who entered. They are the twice born. There is a concept in Jung's work, drawn from William James, who drew it from the mystical traditions, called the twice born. The first birth is the one everyone knows. The entry into the world, into a body, into a family and a name and a history. The formation of the ego, the construction of the persona, the accumulation of the identity that the world will learn to recognize. The second birth is what happens when all of that breaks. Not improvement, not the natural maturation of the firstborn self into a wiser version of the same thing. Something more radical, a death and a resurrection. Not in the theological sense, though Jung noted carefully the psychological truth contained in that theological language, but in the psychological sense, the death of who one was performing, the birth of who one actually is. Not everyone undergoes the second birth. Most people, when the crisis comes, work to restore the firstborn self. They repair the marriage or replace it. They rebuild the career or redirect it. They find a new belief system or return to the old one. They seal the wound. And there is no judgment in this. The restoration of stability is not a failure, but for those in whom the wounded healer archetype is active, for those who are in some sense chosen for a different path, restoration is not available. The wound cannot be sealed. The old self cannot be reconstructed. The materials have been transformed at too fundamental a level. For these people, the second birth is not optional. It is the only path that remains. How does one recognize the wounded healer archetype in a life? Not in theory, but in the actual texture of lived experience. The first signature is the wound that arrives before understanding. It comes early. Sometimes in childhood, the family that did not see you, the parent whose own wound infected the child, the early experience of being outside, different, unable to fit the mold that was offered. It does not make sense at the time. It will not make sense for years, perhaps decades. It is a wound delivered into a life, before the life is large enough to contain its meaning. The twice-born often look back at the wound of their early life and recognize with a quality of awe that is almost uncomfortable, that it was precisely that wound, that specific loss, that precise betrayal, which set in motion the entire trajectory that led them to who they are. The second is the inability to settle into ordinary consolation. Those in whom the wounded healer archetype is active cannot be satisfied by the solutions that satisfy most people. Not because they are superior, they are not, but because something in the psyche recognizes the inadequacy of surface resolution. The conventional therapies reach only so far. The religious reassurances, if they arrive, do not fully land. This is not pathology. It is precision. The wound is too specific for generic healing. The wounded healer is pushed, often against their preference, toward the depths because the depths are the only place where healing commensurate with the wound can be found. The third is the uncanny capacity to enter the suffering of others, not the learned empathy of someone who has studied how to be compassionate, not the professional warmth of someone trained to simulate presence. Something more direct, an almost involuntary resonance with the pain of another human being, a knowing that bypasses explanation and arrives as recognition. People who carry the wounded healer archetype are often described by those around them as having a quality of presence in the midst of suffering that is unlike anyone else. They do not flinch. They do not offer premature comfort. They do not rush toward resolution. They sit with a quality of stillness that comes not from inequanimity, but from acquaintance. They know the dark. And this capacity is not a personality trait. It is not a natural gift in the ordinary sense. It is what the wound became. The fourth is the pull toward a larger purpose that cannot be dismissed. At some point, marked in the inner life with a combination of terror and recognition, a sense arises that the wound was not only for them, that something must be done with it, that the transformation underway in their own psyche is somehow connected to something that extends beyond the boundaries of a single life. This is the collective unconscious pressing through the specific channel of a specific wound. And the archetype of the wounded healer, when fully active, orients a life's not toward personal achievement, but toward service, toward the transmission of hard-won wisdom to those who are still in the darkness the wounded healer has already traversed. The fifth is the long middle, the years that look like nothing from the outside. This is perhaps the least spoken of dimension and the most important to name. The transformation is not quick. The alchemical process, Nigredo, Albedo, Rubedo, is a process of years, sometimes of decades. There are extended periods in the wounded healer's life that, from the outside, look like stagnation, like failure, like the absence of progress. The life seems to be waiting. The gifts are not yet visible. Those around the wounded healer may become impatient. They may suggest that it is time to move on, to recover, to re-enter. They do not understand that what is happening in the interior is the most significant work of that life, and that it requires, above all else, time. Jung was deeply suspicious of accelerated healing. He understood that the psyche had its own timing, and that the imposition of external timelines on the inner work was not merely ineffective, but actively damaging. The wounded healer cannot be rushed, and when the transformation arrives, it arrives completely. In alchemical tradition, the final stage of the great work is the Rubedo. The reddening, the moment when the material that has been blackened in the Nigredo, purified in the Albedo, finally reaches its completed form. Not a return to what it was. Something that was latent within it from the beginning, finally made manifest. In psychological terms, the Rubedo is the moment when the individual has sufficiently integrated the wound to the degree that it becomes the source from which they operate, rather than the weight beneath which they collapse. The Rubedo in the wounded healer's life is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives as a quiet settling, a recognition, the sense that one has finally come to inhabit one's own life. Not the life that was planned, not the life before the wound, but the life that the wound, with its painful and precise intelligence, was always preparing. The wounded healer in the Rubedo does not pretend the wound is gone. They carry it openly, as Chiron carried his, not as a source of shame, but as the mark of a specific initiation. And they stand from that place, at the edge of the darkness that others are still inside. Not to pull people out prematurely, not to map the territory from a safe distance, but to say, from genuine experience, I have been here. I know this place. You are not alone in it. And there is, I can testify to this, there is a through. Now, something must be said that cannot be softened or qualified because it has no softened form. The people who have changed the world, the healers, the teachers, the artists, the ones whose presence rearranged something in the lives of everyone they touched, were not the unbroken ones. They were not the ones who managed to keep all the structures intact, all the masks in place, all the pain at a safe and civilized distance. They were the ones who could not. They were the ones for whom the wound would not close, and who, instead of spending their lives trying to force it shut, eventually understood that the open wound was the opening through which everything true was flowing. Jung himself understood this. He was not a man who had arrived at mastery from a position of comfort. He was a man who had walked into his own darkness, deliberately with a notebook and a pen and a terror he never fully concealed, and had returned with the material that would map the inner life of the 20th century. He paid for that knowledge. The cost was real. The wound was real. And the healing he gave the world was proportional exactly to the depth of that wound. This is not coincidence. This is the law of the wounded healer. And here it is, as clearly as it can be stated. Your greatest wound and your greatest gift are not two different things. They are the same thing, seen from opposite sides of the fire. Read that again, not a consolation, not a reframe designed to make the pain feel prettier. A structural truth about the way the psyche works, a truth that Jung spent his entire life mapping, that the myth of Chiron encodes in its most ancient form, and that the lives of every genuine healer who has ever walked this earth will confirm. The wound that was given to you was not given to you so that you could survive it. It was given to you so that you could become it, transmute it, carry it forward, and make from the substance of the most unbearable experience of your life the exact and irreplaceable thing that only you, with that wound in that form at this depth, can offer to the world. There will be a moment, you may have already had it, or it may still be approaching, when you look back at the wound and you recognize it, not with gratitude necessarily. That is too simple a word for what happens. Recognition is more accurate. The recognition that this exact thing, this specific darkness, this wound that arrived before you were ready and stayed longer than you could bear, this was not an interruption to your life. It was your life. Beginning, Jung said. He sometimes said to things that require years to fully land. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. The wounded healer archetype asks for precisely this, not the acceptance of a curated self, the complete self, the self that includes the wound, not the wound as tragedy, the wound as compass, the wound as the most honest and precise map you have ever been given, pointing with absolute accuracy toward the only version of yourself that is entirely real. This is the work that cannot be delegated. This is the work that no therapist can do for you, no book can complete for you, no practice can substitute for you. It is the work of turning, slowly, willingly, toward the thing inside you that you have most avoided, and finding in the turning that it was never what you feared. It was always what you needed. The alchemical journey does not end. There is no final stage after which the work is complete and the wound is closed, and the twice-born self sits in permanent, unthreatened wholeness. That is not what individuation is. Individuation is a living process, a continuous deepening, a continuous negotiation between the conscious self and the vast intelligence of the unconscious, a continuous willingness to be changed by what is encountered in the depths. What changes is not the wound. What changes is your relationship to it. The wound that was once a site of collapse becomes the site of capacity. The darkness that was once a prison becomes the terrain in which you move with more ease than most people will ever possess. The suffering that once felt like pure loss reveals itself, over time, as a form of education so comprehensive that no other curriculum could have delivered it. Chiron carried his wound until the moment he voluntarily surrendered his immortality, chose death in exchange for the freedom of Prometheus, and was placed by Zeus among the stars. The wound did not disqualify him from that final act of grace. It was the very thing that made him capable of it. The willingness to give up what he most wanted to hold, life itself, immortal life, because something larger was being asked. That is the completed wounded healer, not the one who has recovered, the one who has become large enough to hold both the wound and the world. You may not feel large enough yet. That is all right. The archetype does not require completion before it begins to work through you. It only requires willingness, the willingness to stop running from the wound, the willingness to turn toward it, not with masochistic surrender, but with the curious, unflinching respect one brings to something that has proven itself repeatedly to be more intelligent than the fear it generates. The willingness to ask, not as a cry of despair, but as a genuine question, asked by someone who is ready for a genuine answer. What is the wound trying to make of me? In the next video on this channel, we will follow this thread into territory that is, in many ways, even more demanding. Because the wounded healer does not operate without a shadow. There is a specific darkness that accompanies this archetype. The healer, who, without knowing it, keeps others in the wound rather than leading them through it. The one whose need to be needed becomes indistinguishable from the need to heal. Jung spoke of this directly. He watched it destroy the work of analysts who had not done their own descent deeply enough, and the naming of it, as with all things Jung brought into consciousness from the dark, is the beginning of the only available protection. That is where we are going next. If this video reached something in you, if it gave language to something you have been carrying without a name, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a word in the comments if you are moved to. Not a long explanation, just the word or phrase that rose in you during this hour. Subscribe if you have not. The work here is cumulative. Each video is a layer, and the accumulation, watched in the slow way this material deserves, becomes something close to what Jung described as active imagination, a sustained, deliberate engagement with the unconscious that produces real change in the interior of a life. This is shadow and virtue. The wound is the door, and you have already, by arriving here, begun to open it.